Hello, everyone, and welcome to our WES Perspectives event today on child poverty. Today, we will be speaking to the amazing Alison Garnham, who is CEO of Child Poverty Action Group. She's been CEO here since 2010 and has worked on improving the standard of living for children and reducing poverty her whole career. Without further ado, hello, Alison. Welcome to the discussion today.
Hello, delighted to be here.
Amazing. Thank you so much for joining us today. I would just like to start off by saying we hear a lot about poverty in the news and whilst we're learning about it in economics and politics, and we realize how much of a terrible thing it is. But what is your definition of poverty, and does it change for children compared to adults?
So I always go back to the definition that Professor Peter Townsend came up with. He was one of our founding academic partners, if you like. He was our chair for years and our honorary president until he died in 2009. But he wrote a seminal book on poverty in the UK back in 1979. And in that, he said that individuals, families, and groups in the population can be said to be in poverty when they lack the resources to obtain the type of diet, participate in the activities, and have the living conditions and amenities which are customary or at least widely encouraged or approved in the society that they belong to. So that acts as a kind of a definition of poverty. So it's about lacking resources, and we would never underplay the importance of income and wealth in that, but it's also about services and the ability to participate. When you talk to people on very low incomes, one of the things they feel most strongly is the sense of powerlessness, lack of agency, the inability to participate and influence things. And so that it kind of captures all of that in that definition. But of course, day to day, we need kind of proxy measures to kind of give us an idea about, what sort of income is too low. And for a long time now, we've used the households below average income figures that the DWP and the ONS produce every year. And so we look at how many children are in poverty when they fall below 60% of median income after housing costs. They produce both before and after housing cost figures, but we think after housing costs gives you the best picture of what people's actual disposable income is, because you can't avoid your housing costs essentially. So those are the figures that we go on every year. And of course, that's been looking pretty bad. Since about 2012, child poverty started rising, and it rose by about 700,000 up to the pandemic. So it rose from 3.6 million to 4.3 million children in the UK. It fell slightly when they added the £20 onto people's universal credit and working tax credits, but of course they've taken that away. So that would suggest that we're back to where we started. And of course, when you're talking about child poverty, you're obviously talking about, the whole family circumstances. You're talking about their parents' incomes, because we're not assuming that children are out working or producing income for their families. So
exactly, yeah.
Obviously, it's their parents' incomes we're talking about, but then the consequences of that fall particularly badly on children, because we know, and there's mountains of evidence in the UK about this, that children in poverty tend to be behind in education by about 9 months than their peers. They're more likely to have health problems, limiting lifelong illnesses, more likely to die as children, including in road accidents. And their long-term sort of sense of well-being and self-esteem is affected. So we know that certain types of low income mean that children's life chances are very strongly affected.
Yes, I mean, all very important issues. So we've seen that this has been an issue for a very long time. This has been there for decades now. And so what are the circumstances that often lead to child poverty? And has this changed so recently compared to a few years ago?
Yeah, so I think one of the things we've learned in recent years, particularly in the UK, is that child poverty is policy responsive. If you do the right things, it comes down, and if you do the wrong things, it goes up. And so back in 1998, Tony Blair announced that he would eliminate child poverty in 20 years. And of course, they were only in government for 10 of those 20 years. By the end of that 10 years, because they had a deliberate strategy to reduce child poverty, they did, in fact, reduce child poverty by over 1 million. So we know that the things that they did, which was increasing child benefit, increasing tax credits and so on, did have the effect that it reduced child poverty. But since 2010, and I said the figures started going up after about 2012, unfortunately, we've had a lot of those supports being removed. And we've seen over 50 cuts to social security benefits, including freezes to benefits, which in many ways are the things that had the harshest effects. And that's had the effect of driving child poverty back up again. You know, that's the story is quite simple, if you like, in the UK. We know exactly what's happened. Families lost a considerable amount of money. In fact, this year we're spending £42 billion a year less on social security than we would have been if we'd stuck to 2010 policies. So 42 billion quid has been whipped out of the you know, family economy, if you like. And so it's hardly surprising that when we went into the pandemic, and then now we're going into the cost of living crisis, people had already lived through an incomes crisis caused by government policy. So in many ways, it's better to think of the impact of the pandemic and cost of living crisis as being something that's happening on top of a pre-existing incomes crisis.
Yeah, definitely. And as you were saying about the policy and the cost of living crisis, like it's clearly like a massive issue for us at the moment. And tell us more about how the cost of living crisis is going to impact specifically on children in the UK.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, what happens to parents affects their children, and parents spend a lot of time trying to protect their children from the effect of poverty, but it isn't always possible to do that. In fact, one of the saddest things when you talk to kids in poor families is that they know full well that their parents can't afford things. You know, they know that they wouldn't even ask their parents about an after-school club if there's a cost involved, because they just know there isn't any money. So they subject themselves to kind of, you know, limiting their own possibilities because they know there's not enough cash. So, I mean, the difficulty is that obviously families have different consumption needs. So, you know, some of the responses from government lately have been sort of flat rate, but on average, families in the bottom half of the income distribution with 2 or more children spend twice as much on food, household goods and services, clothing and transport than families without children. They spend 1.3 times as much on energy. And, you know, one of the big cuts has been child benefit, specifically for families with children, has lost 30% of its value since 2010. So the things in place to support the additional cost of children have been severely eroded in recent years. And so what that means in reality is children going without. Yeah. It's as simple as that. We have a project called The Cost of the School Day, where we talk to children and teachers in schools about what can be done to help children with the cost of education. I mean, we think universal education is supposed to be free, but the reality is there are all sorts of costs that go with it. You know, there are children going to school hungry, they haven't got the right uniform, their shoes aren't suitable, they're left in the classroom because they can't afford to go on school trips. Increasingly, we're hearing about families who can't afford the transport cost to get them to school. And, you know, there's mad things like, you know, schools specify a £40 blazer and then they run a sort of a clothes bank in the school for kids who can't afford them. I mean, what's that about, you know? Plus the office is running around trying to collect unpaid school meal funds while they're running a food bank for the kids who can't afford it. So, you know, there are all sorts of things sort of going badly wrong for children, and very often their experiences in the home, yeah, but also in school. One of the saddest things is that they often say that they can't afford the course that they want to do, because some courses you need to have kit. You know, you're either required to be online, or you have, you know, if it's media, you're supposed to have a camera, you know, and if you can't afford those things, then you avoid the courses that involve those extra costs. So it all has a big impact on children, basically.
Yeah, no, and I think your emphasis on schools is really important, because I think some people forget, like they almost think that as soon when you're in school, you're safe from all of that things, you know, everything's provided for you. But you're right, everything around it is so important, and it's all about that exclusion, isn't it? It's all about children not being able to do the things that other children might have done as a result of this. And
you can see how that has a knock-on effect onto children's self-esteem. You know, if you're the kid sat at the back trying to avoid people's eye contact when everyone else is putting their hands up about a school trip, that makes you feel bad, you know.
100%.
So it's very serious, the impact it has on children.
Yes, definitely. So we've seen that the government has been trying to put in measures to combat this issue. You spoke before about how the £20 universal credit bonus has now been taken away.
Yeah.
How would you respond to the action that's been taken by the government? What do you think they've done well during this crisis, and what do you think needs to be improved on?
I mean, the good thing is that they have responded, and they have responded through the benefits system, which is progress, because previously they kept talking about other things, you know, let's talk about getting people into jobs and all that kind of thing. And yet, you know, one of the things that's gone alongside this sort of incomes crisis for low-income families has been stagnating wages. One of the reasons why so many families are now getting a top-up through universal credit, because it's also an in-work benefit, is because their wages are so low. And I think, you know, the Resolution Foundation says that we haven't had such slow wage increases since the Battle of Trafalgar or something, you know, so that's the longest period of stagnation of wages. So no wonder we're reaching the point now where people are starting to make demands about wages. So the government introduced the £20 and then took it away. But in substitute for that, they decided to reduce the taper-rated universal credit and increase the work allowances, which were things that they'd actually cut previously. So they restored some of the cuts in terms of what happens once you get a job. But the problem is it only really helped people who are working substantial numbers of hours. So people on fewer hours, or people who are sick and disabled, or with very young children who couldn't work, didn't get anything at all out of that. So there are still huge sort of groups of people on universal credit who haven't benefited from that change. And now the latest one, the one-off payments package that's intended to meet the cost of energy rises. Well, that's precisely what it does. It's actually, by our calculations, it'll cover about 3/4 of the increase in energy bills since the start of this year. But of course, it doesn't do anything to restore all those cuts to benefits that happened before. So there's another job that needs to be done to actually look at social security, how it's become so inadequate that people have ended up going to food banks. It should be a source of enormous shame that we have a system that doesn't prevent that. How on earth have we got this thing happening? The whole point of social security was supposed to be to provide people with sufficient support to protect them during the times in their life when they can't earn or when their earnings are low. And yet it isn't doing. You know, people are having to go and get help elsewhere through basically what we used to call parish relief. And that's just not acceptable. Just one interesting thing about, you know, the basic rate of benefits is the same as it was 30 years ago, like the single adult rate. And it works out at 13% of average earnings. Wow. You know, back in the 60s and 70s, it was about half or 3/4 of average earnings. It's now 13%. So that's how far benefits have fallen behind. So, you know, this latest package is incredibly welcome, of course, you know, because people need cash. So right answer, but a lot more is needed.
Yeah, of course. And your work in Child Poverty Action Group has been really helping some of the most vulnerable in society, not only with like the resources that they need, but also with the legal help. And you fought many legal cases to do with helping people receive that benefits that they need.
Yes.
Tell us more about some of the campaigns that the Action Group is doing, and what impact will it have on people's lives?
So one of them I just mentioned, our Cost of the School Day project is, campaigning with Department of Education, and also we have now a coalition across the teachers' unions and head teachers' unions, all working together to try and do things like improve free school meals. Ideally, we'd want there to be universal free school meals, but at least it should go to all the children on universal credit. We calculated about 800,000 children are in poverty but don't qualify for free school meals, which is mad. So there's a huge amount that needs to be done about that. And of course, school uniform grants. We run an advice line so that people who are working on the front line advising people can get help from our experts on how the social security system works. And they particularly come to us about the really difficult, the really knotty issues. And then when it's a case where we can see it could have an impact on lots of people, we take strategic cases to the court. So we would go to the court, judicially review, or take a case further through the courts in order to try and get a better situation for everybody. So we call it our strategic litigation service. We also have advice on judicial review and upper tribunals so that we can help people prepare their case, and also help advisors to take action when they might have thought they couldn't. Lots of them are frightened of judicial review. They think, well, you need a solicitor for that, but you don't. So we teach people how to do a letter before action to challenge the decision. We have something called the early warning system, where we collect information about all the cases that we come across, and then we pass that on to Department for Work and Pensions, because it helps them to see where things are not working. So it's a really useful kind of feedback loop, so that they get to hear about what's going wrong on the ground, and then we can make suggestions about how it could work better. And a lot of our materials, for a long time we've produced a book called the Tax Credits and Welfare Benefits Handbook, that everybody uses to calculate how much people benefits should be. And more that's being produced online. So we've now produced something called Ask CPAG, so people can tap into that book, but also all the other things around it, and get sort of pre-populated letters to ask for appeals and all that sort of stuff. So we're kind of stepping up what we can do to help people on the front line, to make sure people get what they're entitled to.
Yeah, that's amazing, and I'm sure the help is really welcomed. I was looking at your website, and one of the campaigns which really interested me was the two-child benefit limit.
Yes.
I felt that that's something which isn't very well highlighted. I wondered if you could tell me a bit more about that.
Well, that's a really good point. The single most effective thing you could do at the moment to reduce child poverty would be to abolish the two-child policy and the benefit cap. So this is a policy which says that if you have a third child, you don't get any money for them.
Right.
So there's a limit on how much benefit you can get. So instead of responding to need, there's an artificial cap, and then the benefit cap on top of that affects people, usually people who are out of work. And again, it affects people who tend to have larger families or who have very high rents. A lot of which is out of people's control, of course. In both cases, it has a very strong impact on single parents. The benefit cap, it affects mostly single parents, in fact. 85% of the people affected by the benefit cap have children, and about 3/4 of them are single parents. And in the case of the two-child policy, in that case, it's mostly working parents. So the government had this idea that somehow they were going to attack this idea that you can be on benefit and have more children. In fact, they're attacking a completely different group. They're attacking people who, whilst they were working, decided to have the family size that they did, but didn't know that they would find themselves on benefit later. And so that tells you a massive truth about who people on benefit are. The popular myth is that people hanging around not working. The reality is very few people on benefit these days are unemployed. People who lose their job in general are back in the labour market within 9 to 12 months. If anything, the truth about British workers is that they get back into work really quickly. And so what you're looking at is a dynamic situation where people move in and out of low paid work. So these families are being caught when they find themselves on universal credit. They've got 3 children, but the government won't pay them anything for their 3rd child. This is the single strongest factor at the moment driving up rates of child poverty. It's particularly larger families that are being affected. So it has a very gendered impact, but it also has a very strong impact on Black and minority ethnic families, because very often those communities are often the poorest community in the UK is the Bangladeshi and Pakistani community. Often they would tend to have larger families, but also there are Hasidic Jewish families, there are Catholic families and so on. So there's a very sort of strong sort of ethnic dimension to this, which is deeply unpleasant. So as I say, the single most useful thing a government could do at the moment would be to abolish those 2 policies, the 2-child policy and the benefit cap, which would not be hugely expensive, but would reduce child poverty significantly.
Yeah, no, definitely. When I saw that on your website, I didn't know it was a thing, and I just felt, how unfair is that? The fact that you're not going to support all of the children a family has. Yeah. Why should some children receive support and some others not? That would be completely unfair.
It's unprecedented. It's absolutely extraordinary. I mean, it came in 2015, at the same time when George Osborne also sort of torpedoed universal credit and took lots of things out of it as well. But I think, and it's been admitted now that it's mostly there because it was regarded as being politically popular, because people say things like, well, if you can't afford to have children, you can't have them. And so they think it's popular with the public. But I think if the public understood what was being done and which the families were that were being affected and the impact on their children, it's just, it's unconscionable.
Yeah, no, I thought it was completely outrageous, to be honest.
Yeah.
So we spoke about all of the great work that you've been doing as Child Poverty Action Group, but of course it is the government that has to put in these policies to create the real change. Where do you feel like the responsibility lies between charities and action groups like yourself and the government to fill in the gaps of where people have the need?
Yeah, well, I think that, the biggest thing that we would push for, obviously all the changes to social security that I'm talking about are hugely important, but they need to be part of an overall child poverty strategy. In Scotland, they've already got one. So they've got a strategy very much like the one the UK government used to have over a decade ago, where they've got targets to meet in order to get child poverty down. They've introduced a new child payment, £25 per child. And it looks like the number crunching we've done suggests that will start to bring down child poverty rates in Scotland to the level they were back in 2010. So we need to do that for the rest of the country. So we need a UK government that's prepared to have a strategy to be intent on reducing child poverty. That, of course, means action on incomes, but also across the board. Every government department used to have a policy on child poverty. So the education department, the health department, there was cross-government shared responsibility for making sure that their policies help to reduce child poverty. And that's what we need again.
Yes, definitely. With the situation looking quite bleak, to be completely honest, with COVID and with the cost of living crisis, what will the situation be like in 5 years' time, and what can we do to change this?
Well, I mean, it's not looking good at the moment, is it? I mean, the cost of living crisis makes all of this pressure even stronger. So you've got poor families who've had no proper improvements in their income for a long time. As I say, they've lived through an incomes crisis. Now they're facing a cost of living crisis. I think it's really scary, actually. We used to say families are choosing between eating and heating. Now they're doing neither. Where is there to go when you're really seriously lacking resources? So we just need to campaign all the harder. You know, we've got to get some action on this. Maybe the leadership contest will lead to some kind of change in intent around these sorts of issues. We've got an election coming up, probably, you know, in about 18 months' time. There's a lot to argue about at the moment, and I think, you know, if anyone's interested in helping us, then by all means join Child Poverty Action Group. You know, we're part of a coalition called the End Child Poverty Coalition, and their website will give you child poverty statistics for whichever part of the country you live in, by region, by local authority, by constituency, and get your local MP to raise it in Parliament. You know, I think, you know, we all need to campaign to make sure this is top of the agenda when it comes to the next election.
Absolutely, yeah. And I was going to ask you, like, for the students of economics and politics who are going to be interested in watching this debate today, what are the things that you feel like we should really be trying to learn about, and what should we just try to do so that when we become those policymakers and those people who can influence these decisions, what are the things that we should really like take to heart and really pay attention to?
I think, you know, who could be more vulnerable than the children in society? And at the moment, we have virtually no focus on children in government in terms of their policy. I think, you know, you take anything with you, it's that we need to focus on children. Children are everybody's future. They're going to be paying our pensions when we're older. You know, their prospects will matter to everybody. And of course, the important thing is not just that their prospects affect other people, it's that they deserve a decent life. So the focus on children, the focus on the effects on children, and getting policies that make their lives better should be a top priority for everybody.
100%. Well, thank you so much for talking for us today. And I'm sure everyone watching has really learned about the impact of the cost of living crisis and the pandemic, which is having on young people. And hopefully the future is brighter with the work of your action group.
Thanks. Oh, no, I've enjoyed it. Thank you very much for inviting me.
No problem. Thank you very much. And thank you all for watching, and goodbye.